But the problem was that the mill was too far out of Manchester and there was no local supply of labourers to work there. Ever the savvy businessman, Samuel Gregg looked to the local workhouses and orphanages, where he found a ready supply of children who formed his first unpaid workforce. The Apprentice House was built to house the children and dates from around 1802. The new apprentices would sign indentures. These were legally binding documents which stated how long the child would work at the mill for. Some indentures could last for up to 12 years, but generally ran from the age of 9 to 18. Unlike the child apprentices at some of the bigger mills in Manchester, the children at Quarry Mill were educated in the evenings. Boys were taught maths, English and science by a paid schoolmaster. The majority of girls at Quarry also learned how to read and write. However, it was generally believed that a girl's brain was not large enough to absorb information, and if girls were properly educated, it could cause mental illness, or even worse, ruin their marriage prospects by causing them to grow a beard. Samuel Gregg didn't believe in physically punishing children if they misbehaved. However, this was purely a business decision and was not based on any compassion for the children. Samuel Gregg knew that a beaten child would be unable to work as hard in his mill, and so he preferred to punish them by other methods. The preferred method was overtime punishment, where you would receive a fine and pay back that fine using extra hours of work. 1 hour of work equated to 1 penny knocked off your debt, so being disobedient could get very, very expensive. At any one time, there could be up to 60 girls and 30 boys living at the Apprentice House. The children slept in dormitories, and there was one large room for the girls, whilst the boys were spread out over 3. The apprentices slept 2 to a bed. Apprentice houses in the larger cities were known to have up to 6 children sharing, and it was not uncommon for them to sleep on the floor. Compared to conditions in the workhouse or even in the orphanage, this was luxury. The house was managed by a series of married couples, the most notorious being Mr. and Mrs. Shawcross. Children were woken up at 5:30 a.m. and locked in at night to prevent runaways. Thomas Priestley was 13 when he ran away one Sunday afternoon whilst walking to church. He was later reprimanded and arrested in London. His testimony is the reason we know so much about the conditions here at the Apprentice House at Quarry Mill. Indentures were only offered to healthy, strong children, and this was assessed upon their arrival by way of medical examination. The physician at Quarry Mill was Mr. Peter Holland. Like the Greggs, he was a nonconformist, and whilst he was trained in all aspects of medicine, he was unable to call himself a doctor due to his religious beliefs. By law, children had to be 9 years of age to work in the mill, but with few children knowing their date of birth and little written proof, this was ascertained using approved methods, even though these are fairly dubious by today's standards. The apprentices received the highest standards of medical care. In the early 19th century, doctors believed that the body was made up of 4 humours: phlegm, blood, black bile and yellow bile. If these became unbalanced, then that was why you became sick. Samuel Gregg insisted on the best care for the children, because healthy workers were better workers. Children would often arrive at Quarry Mill malnourished as a result of poor diets from the workhouse. The Greggs believed in feeding their apprentices well, but this could cause issues. A common complaint was constipation, which was treated with a mixture of treacle and brimstone. Brimstone is another word for sulphur, a key ingredient of gunpowder, and the thought behind this is that it could also cause an explosion in your chamber pot. Irritation of the eyes, caused by the fine cotton dust of the mill, was thought to be because of an excess of blood, and this was treated with leeches. The children ate 3 times a day, with the majority of food grown in the Apprentice House gardens by the children themselves. The apprentices started work at 6, but breakfast wouldn't be served until 8. This was usually a thick, hearty porridge made from oats and milk, and would be scooped out from a big pot in the mill yard, and eaten straight from the hand. There would be no time for bowls and spoons. Dinner would be porridge too, with extra vegetables thrown into the pot, whereas tea would be a hearty stew, or bacon and potatoes. The Greggs owned a dairy farm, so milk, cheese and butter were plentiful. The Quarry Bank Mill child apprentices were looked after, but at the end of the day, to do so was purely a business decision. Samuel Gregg knew that a strong, healthy child was going to be a strong, healthy worker. Apprentices were free to leave when their indentures were spent, usually sometime after their 18th birthdays. Some apprentices moved on from Quarry Bank and left, or took other jobs on the estate, but most of them stayed on at the mill as paid workers. Samuel Gregg built the village at Stile to house the workers of Quarry Bank, and a lot of the apprentice children went on to settle there and have families of their own. It's surprising to think that they would send their own children to work in the mill, but they did. These children, however, were called free children and received payment for their labour. Due to the employment of free children, and then a series of factory acts, the apprentice house system became financially unviable for the Greggs. By 1833, apprentices only made up 20% of the workforce, and by 1847, the apprentice system was abandoned. Life at the apprentice house seems harsh, brutal, and unforgiving. But this was a harsh, brutal, and unforgiving period of British history, and a lot is owed to the unpaid child workers of Quarry Bank Mill, who helped kickstart the Industrial Revolution.